Good morning and good afternoon, wherever you may tune in from. Welcome to our session on integrating social and environmental responsibility in finance. Let me start today's session with a short anecdote. In 2018, the French government issued a carbon tax on petrol and diesel. President Macron proudly presented it as evidence of French global leadership on mitigating climate change. Shortly after the announcement, violent protests erupted amongst the working class, who felt unfairly burdened by the measure. What became known as the Yellow Vest movement took 3 million people to the streets in Paris. The riots lasted weeks. The city was brought to a standstill. The government was pushed into a crisis. If we can learn one thing from this episode, is that climate action must keep the interests of the bottom of the pyramid into account. The green economic transition will be just, or it will just not be. In this transition, the financial sector has a pivotal role to play. Nobody doubts that it's a key agent in enabling a green and social economic transformation. International calls and initiatives to enlist the financial sector as a catalyst for change are increasing, especially as the availability of public fund decreases. Historically, the financial sector development was mainly concerned with social performance, like poverty alleviation, financial and economic inclusion, or economic empowerment. Since the Paris Agreement in 2015, however, we've seen a massive shift of political priorities towards green finance. We witnessed the emergence of numerous organizations and initiatives that solely are active in this space. And for some years, green finance and social finance, and for now, I group financial inclusion in here, seemed entirely different worlds. In the recent years, however, I am observing an increasing convergence of social and environmental objectives in financial sector development. On the social side, we see that the financial inclusion community explored the concept of inclusive green finance. SME and ag finance now ventures into green SME and green ag finance. And on the environmental side, a similar thing is happening. Banks started with environmental risk management and now expand to environmental and social risk management. Capital markets started to issue green bonds, but more recently expanded to social bonds and sustainability bonds. We've also seen many countries enact green taxonomies, but lately an increasing number of countries expands these taxonomies into the social realm. Climate change increases poverty. The World Bank estimates that it will push up to 130 million people into poverty. Therefore, it's only natural that the financial sector stakeholders increasingly pursue synergies in environmental and social finance. But what if fighting climate change increasing poverty? Admittedly, this is a provocative line, but the carbon tax in France shows that well-meaning policies can have unintended social consequences if they don't hardwire social concerns into them. The work in the financial sector so far has largely focused on identifying synergies between environmental and social goals. What's comparatively unexplored is the question of trade-offs between policy intents and potential unintended consequences of green finance on the poor. Today, in today's session, we want to take stock of where we stand globally. We will highlight specific examples where social and environmental responsibility already converge in finance. We'll examine if and how we can strengthen approaches that consider both elements and how we can strive for synergies and avoid trade-offs. Finally, we'll explore the role of financial inclusion, all of this conceptually and practically. Is financial inclusion part of sustainable finance? The answer matters because sustainable finance enjoys a lot of political attention. The opportunity is to bring financial inclusion advocacy to new and politically influential audiences. We'll discuss these questions today with three panelists. I have Nuru Mugambi from the Sustainable Banking and Finance Network, housed by the IFC. I have Joana Pedro from UNEP-FI and Carlos Torres from GIZ Mexico. And let me start with you, Nuru. You're an advisor to the Sustainable Banking and Finance Network, which is a network of financial sector policymakers to advance sustainable finance. Looking back, you started out with a focus on green finance, but then expanded to social objectives. Tell us about the history of your organization's perspective on this convergence.
Yeah, thank you so much. And it's really good to be here. So as you rightly said, so I represent SBFN. SBFN was founded in 2012, really as a response to about 10 banking supervisors who wanted to create a platform to engage and share knowledge on good practice in the area of sustainable finance. And as you mentioned at the time, the main focus really of sustainable finance was looking at that economic and environmental dimensions of sustainable finance. And that social aspect really was being addressed through ESG risk management policy measures. Now, meanwhile, regulators were also increasingly enhancing their financial inclusion policies. So kind of in parallel, were enhancing their financial inclusion policies as they were looking to better support and expand their mandates in support of the national priorities. So over time, as regulators and industry bodies have built their sustainable finance capacity, if you will, they've also been able to gain a greater appreciation of that interconnectedness of these themes of inclusion, stability, innovation, ESG, but not just looking at ESG from a risk management perspective. So there is that broadening of the concept of sustainable finance. And now from SBFN, our members really look at twin objectives, right? So there's still that need for ESG risk management and performance to be looked at, especially bringing in concepts around climate and nature, but at the same time, really not diminishing the need and really just advancing that need for capital flows towards, environmental and social benefits. So we've seen SBFN members really supported through various partnerships, including with GIZ, the Center for Financial Inclusion, AFI, really coming together to help really just define what are those drivers around inclusive green finance. So I'm sure you're all familiar with the recent publication that was put out through Queen Maxima's office. And Queen Maxima, for those who don't know, is the UN's special advisor on inclusive green finance. And there was this working group that really worked on really trying to define what is that nexus of inclusion and green. And I think that really will help concretize this need of really just defining the need to really integrate financial inclusion with the green finance agenda. So really, in summary, we're seeing that evolution of sustainable finance policy and integration of green finance and inclusion agendas. Yeah.
Thank you, Nuru. So broadening the concept of sustainable finance is definitely a trend and going beyond risk management. I read the paper. I thought it was very good, very specific. I recommend to the audience to read this paper. Yes. Let me go to you, Joana. You're a social lead at UNEP-FI, which is a network of financial institutions. So now we're going to the financial institution level that works to advance sustainability outcomes. UNEP carries the word environment in its name, but lately I've noticed that your organization is increasingly working on social issues. Can you talk a little bit about the perspective of your organization on this evolution?
Hi everyone, and thank you, Klaus. It's great to be again in a panel moderated by you. So yes, as you mentioned, so UNEP FI belongs to UNEP, and UNEP is the environmental agency of the UN. Nevertheless, I just to say that the mission of UNEP is to inspire, inform, and enable nations and people to improve their quality of life without compromising that of future generations. So it is the environmental agency, but if you hear the mission, people and future generations are there, because of course people and planet are not two different things that we can have separate. And I think that has come even more forward with last year with approval of the right of a healthy environment, that UNEP worked quite a lot to make it happen, which again looks at this, that for us to fulfill our human rights, we do need a planet where we can live. And so this connection between human rights and the environment is very, very clear. And so while there is other UN organizations that are, of course, much more looking specifically into different social aspects, there is UN Women, the International Labour Organization, the Human Rights Secretariat. But what we try to see is how to embed this, how to ensure that within UNEP work, there is a human rights-based approach, there is gender mainstreaming, and in general, the social aspects are taken into consideration when looking at the environment. And then specifically for UNEP FI and looking at sustainability, social has been there from the beginning, and human rights as well. But indeed, as you said, Klaus, it's becoming more and more predominant. And there's also what we see as well is that there's also coming from a request from the industry. And I think that's very interesting. Of course, that comes from different reasons, but there is clearly, we can see that demand from the industry on prioritizing the social aspects, gender, financial health and inclusion, just transition. So it's thematics that we are really seeing as a need to work more towards. So I think there's also the change that you've been seeing.
Yeah, very interesting. I think that's one of the most interesting points, that this is actually not donor driven anymore, but comes from financial institutions and is actually a demand from the private sector, Joanna. Very interesting point. Okay, Nuro, back to you. Let's get to the meat of the work. I would like to ask you for specific examples of financial sector policies where you see the convergence of the environmental and social intent. What's out there?
Yeah, maybe where I can start is how we're defining good practice in that convergence, right? So we spoke briefly about this working group that was headed by Queen Maxima in her capacity as the UN Secretary General Special Advocate for Inclusive Finance. And one of the things that technical paper did was really just define the framework. And it looked at three broad areas. So the first being really making sure that there's an integration of inclusive green finance at the country level. So this is one of those indicators that we're looking for. The second is really looking at the use of information and data. So good practice really looks for how are you having a very clearly articulated research agenda to utilize that data to design products, to guide market supervision, and really just help articulate those use cases for inclusive green finance. And then the third indicator that you're looking for in good practice is really how is inclusive green finance being integrated in the regulatory framework, both at the national, regional, and international level. So how are we ensuring that there is that enabling environment that is presented by the policymakers? So really looking at those three indicators, I can share some examples of good practice from SBFN. A number of our members are active in terms of really that international collaboration, that indicator of enabling environment. We've seen, for example, Bank Al Maghrib in Morocco really coming out clearly with its gender aspect of financial inclusion and the green agenda. In Bangladesh, we've also seen these indicators. We've also seen examples of countries that are linking up their national financial inclusion strategies with sustainability themes. So as much as previously we saw that parallel sustainable finance and inclusion, we're now seeing that coming a bit, that overlap. And a good example I can share there is Reserve Bank of Fiji. So in Fiji, they've been able to include climate change in terms of product development and product innovation, but in particularly within the insurance sector. So sometimes I think we often just think about banking. In fact, SBFN used to be SBN, right? It used to be the Sustainable Banking Network, but then now it's Sustainable Banking and Finance Network. So I think as you know, this space broadens and we get more refined in our agenda setting and in our policy articulation, you then see aspects like capital markets and insurance being factored more clearly from a policy maker's perspective. In South Africa, that's another good example to talk about. In South Africa, we've seen a working group being set up to really look at sustainable finance and inclusion. BASA, which is the Banking Association of South Africa, recently worked with UNCDF to publish a report. I mentioned capital markets. So in Indonesia, they have a green taxonomy. And in that taxonomy, it's guided by 4 principles. And one of the principles really speaks clearly about the social dimension of investments. And they define the green economy from a low carbon, resource efficient, and socially inclusive. So really just looking at, you know, when you're structuring your instruments and targeting that green economy, it's not just about the green aspect, but also social inclusion. And then maybe I can speak finally around Argentina. In Argentina, their Securities and Exchange Commission published guidelines to promote the development of financial instruments that have both a positive social and environmental impact. So they define sustainable securities as having social impact as well as green. So there's so many examples that we've seen increasingly as regulators really try to meet that nexus of green and social. Yeah.
So it's becoming a rich field of work. I just summarize a little bit. So data drives policy, having your research agenda straight, integrating it into national strategies. That's something that, you know, we've seen early. And of course, Fiji, whenever, you know, like the inclusion and climate comes together, Fiji is at the forefront. But also interesting for Indonesia, GIZ actually has a project where we will expand the green taxonomy now to social aspects. So they forge ahead on this topic. Very interesting. Thank you, Nuro.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, so let's turn again back to Joanna to come to the financial institution level after we've looked a little bit at the policy. Joanna, same question for you. What do you see at the financial institution level in your network? Where do you see this convergence of environmental and social intent?
Thank you, Klaus. So I think, as I was saying before about the changes, I think it's something that we are seeing as a change, and it's still not, I would not say that it's something that is the norm still, but we do see that there's more and more financial institutions wanting and requesting how can we do that, and trying to find ways on how to connect both social and environment. So the discussion is more and more there. And from what we've been seeing, there's, I think, 3 points where we see more examples coming. One is how banks and financial institutions are measuring and using metrics. The other one is on products itself. And then that you mentioned already, Klaus, in the beginning, is also on the due diligence. So those are the 3 areas that we see it. So for specific examples that you asked, so to bring specific things for the table to see that it is being done and is not just being talked about. So we have, for instance, within our network, we have, for instance, City in Canada, who have recognized that financial health and inclusion can be affected by climate and climate justice. And therefore, they started measuring the influence of climate within financial health and inclusion. So when doing their metrics and doing their measures of financial health and inclusion, they look also on events that have happened, so climate events that have happened in the last 12 to 24 months, how their clients perceive that they will have to use money in the future for extreme events that will happen, and how they perceive their financial health is going to be influenced by weather events. So that's one of the things on looking at metrics, and how we use also metrics on climate within financial health and inclusion. Then on products offering, we have, for instance, BNP in Belgium, who has an initiative aiming on decarbonizing the real estate, private real estate, so housing. And they are specifically, again, targeting vulnerable groups by promoting and spreading information on how to get to subsidize, to grants, and supporting them with the process to find the most affordable solutions and most affordable options to actually get to green housing for vulnerable groups. And there, I had not put it as examples, but Nuru just spoke with on insurance. And there we also see indeed a lot of examples. I didn't prepare for the session but I think just very simple examples as the pay-as-you-go in car insurance, where you are both allowing for vulnerable, for people that don't have as access to finance to pay less, but at the same time you also making that people do less millage, because that has also then impact on CO2. So there is quite a few examples out there also on insurance side, and very interesting ones. And then, and you mentioned already, Klaus, it's the part of this, the environmental due diligence becoming more and more environmental social due diligence. And that we see coming also from regulation. Clearly, we have been discussed at the moment at the EU, the directive on whether human rights and environmental due diligence should apply also for financial institutions and banks. We see different in different jurisdictions, both by, and I think Carlos will speak a bit to it, but from the taxonomies, from the disclosure frameworks, from the directives that are coming up, we see really a change in the regulatory framework, and also a change within the financial industry. More and more, there will be teams not only of environmental, but environmental and social, or environmental and human rights. And more we see this integration of environmental and social when doing the due diligence. And again, more and more we see not only looking at how this impacts the business, but how the business impacts both environmental and social. So we do see that change happening.
Allow me a quick follow-up there. You mentioned banks from Belgium and Canada. Is it fair to say that this is something that you see more in developed countries and less in emerging and developing countries?
Our network has more banks in more members in Europe. So it would be unfair to say that, because our sample to start with, it's not good. So from our side, we would have always more examples there, because it's where our network is at the moment bigger. We have around 60% of our members in Europe.
Fair enough. Okay, so now let me bring in the concept of financial inclusion for both of you, Nuru and Joanna. How do you conceptually think financial inclusion fits in this convergence between environment and social? Take a stab at it. Nuru, you want to start?
Sure. Actually, I also wanted to, so Joanna, sorry you didn't prepare on the insurance side. Another good product example I've seen, for example, in Kenya, is really this aspect of weather index insurance, right? And targeting, pastoralist communities. We have a lot of communities across Africa that are increasingly being exposed to drought. And more frequently recurring and extreme drought. So Takafo, for example, comes to mind when you were speaking. It's a company that has innovated based on satellite imagery, drone technology, and obviously really just looking at indexing around weather. and dispersing claims through mobile. So it's a good example of that
Yep.
comprehensive aspect of financial inclusion. So looking at that full suite of financial products. So maybe that's also a good example that helps me parlay into really that concept that you're asking around inclusion, and just making sure that there is that enabling environments for such product innovation to happen. So I think for me, when I think about inclusion, I think about outcomes. So Klaus, that's really where my conceptualization starts. And one of the areas I think about is water, right? So I know we often talk about energy poverty, but I think water is probably more critical because, like, where in Kenya, where I come from, a lot of our power is hydro generated. So I always think about water when I'm thinking about inclusion, and you know, when you think about some of the data that comes out around that highlights how water is so significant, you know, economies, especially in the emerging markets, their growth rates are pinned on water resilience, right? So therefore, we need to know and recognize that there are those environmental impacts that are correlated with financial resilience at the household level. So if my aunt is not able to have water for her crops, to have clean water to cook, so you have those product related challenges. She's not able to produce her agricultural product to take to the market. You've got health challenges, her children get sick. So how do you create a framework that enables her? So that's when you think about, for example, mini hydro plants, right? So in a lot of communities in Africa, communities are coming together because they do not have access to water. They're coming together to create mini hydro plants. And fintech is enabling the disbursement of payments to keep these projects running and being financially sustainable. So thinking through that thought of water and inclusion, you realize that the financial sector is uniquely positioned to address how well a household can be both financially resilient by being productive in the economy, but also climate resilient, therefore contributing to output. So bringing it back to SPFN, I think we see financial inclusion policy trying to tie both sides. And really the approach not only tries to promote the aspect of risk, but also the economic opportunity. So like when you think about that mini hydro plant, for example, it really is, it's a wonderful story of innovation. It's not that traditional ESG risk management, climate risk management lens that we typically look at. So there are two countries that I think I can bring to mind here. Sri Lanka, for example, really tries to look at that opportunity side, right? So for example, the Central Bank of Sri Lanka is looking to introduce grants and risk-sharing facilities to help promote these micro projects and sustainable startups, and really try to promote that innovation at the micro level. Central Bank of Azerbaijan also, they recently published their sustainable finance roadmap. And what I like about them is they're defining inclusion. They're going beyond gender and age and SME, which I think the three pillars that we typically look at from an inclusion perspective. They're also talking about PWD, persons with disabilities, right? So to me, that I'm really passionate about that, because I think we don't realize that all of us is a potential PWD, right? Everyone on this session could be a person with disabilities, and many of us face temporary disabilities because of health conditions or permanent disabilities, right? So I read somewhere approximately 80% of the PWD, the global PWD community, lives in the developing world. So when you think about innovation, when you think about inclusivity, this whole conceptualization of financial inclusion and inclusive green finance, I think you need to think about the opportunity side more than the risk management side.
Okay.
So, Yeah.
So that was very practical, but let me probe you a little further on the conceptual level. So from your perspective, when I listen to you, financial inclusion is definitely an integral part of sustainable finance. Is that a fair statement?
Yes, it is. It is, absolutely.
All right.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll give you an example. Sorry, I know you're saying practical, but because it's so interesting. Oftentimes when we're in these sessions, we're too conceptual and everyone is asking on the chat, give us
We want to
practical
have both.
examples.
We want both. We want both. We want
Yeah.
practice and concepts.
Yeah, but really, Klaus, I think this issue of financial inclusion, interconnectedness with sustainable finance, to me, I think emerging markets already appreciated this more, right?
Yeah.
So I think the social aspect has always been on the forefront of policymakers in the financial sector. It is the priority. I remember there was one time I was really trying to advocate for green bonds with the CEO of a major DFI in Africa, and he said, Nuru, we're trying to feed our people. We're trying to fuel our industries to minimize income inequality. We are the least emitting country on the continent. Please don't talk to us about carbon emissions.
It's a feedback that we get a lot in when we're in Africa. Yeah, thank you, Nura. I can only agree to what you said. It's a common feedback that you get. But let's get back to the conversation. I also, Joanna, want to give you the opportunity to answer the same question. Conceptually, sustainable finance, financial inclusion, how does it fit into all of this? What's your take?
Yeah, thank you. I think Nora said most of it, so I don't have much to add. Yep. But yes, I think from UNEP-FI side, we do see it as an enabler for other impacts to happen. So we see it as an enabler of sustainable finance. And actually, we have our principles for responsible banking, where we push for for sustainability as a whole. And within, we do have a commitment on financial health and inclusion, where we have 34 banks from our overall more than 350 banks that are part of the PRB. We have then 34 banks looking specifically and have a commitment on financial health and inclusion. We just published the first, so they're setting targets on financial health and inclusion. We just published the first report on the targets that are being published. And just one that is very direct, but we see right away that a quarter of these banks are having gender equality also as a target at the same time that they are targeting financial health and inclusion. So very direct already. Another target is there. And Nuru gave the example using water, but I mean, clearly the financial health and inclusion is an enabler for food security, for decent work, for poverty alleviation, but also for making decisions when it comes for climate and environment. Because if I have the financial means to make different decisions when it relates to environmental and climate, that also makes a difference. So it's very connected, and we do see it as an enabler for overall sustainability finance.
Okay, very clear, financial inclusion as an enabler. Thank you very much, Joanna. So we have one question from the audience about unintended consequences. We'll come to that later in the conversation, so bear with us. We'll address this at a later stage. Now, I actually would like to start with you, Carlos. You are working for GIZ Mexico, where you're an advisor. You have supported the Mexican government with drafting a sustainability taxonomy. I understand that the inspiration was the EU green taxonomy, but Mexico very quickly chose a more holistic sustainability approach. Can you tell us how this came about, and maybe start for this global audience by explaining what is a taxonomy for those who don't know? Carlos.
Yeah, sure. And thank you very much for inviting us. Thank you for including the GIZ. I have some internet connection, so I hope that you all hear me. Please let me know if you don't. So the investors and the credit institutions need, that's the principle. They need information to take their decisions. Okay, so they need information about what is a green asset, what is a social asset, and what are the repercussions of their investments. And they need to have a common understanding of what this is. So a taxonomy and it's a concept that it's introduced from the biology, is a set of conditions or characteristics that define what a green asset or a social asset is. So it's basically a guideline that gives you some technical parameters to determine what a sustainable economical activity is. And what does this mean? It gives you metrics and thresholds for each of these activities. It has do no significant harm principles, which means that an economic activity cannot harm any other of the principles, and it has minimal safeguards for them to work as a whole. So Mexico started this process in 2020, and as you said, it had the previous examples, of course, of the European Union, which has a green taxonomy, a very, very deep and very successful green taxonomy. It had also the Chinese taxonomy as an example, and it had a regional taxonomy as well, that is the Colombian one. And there are some other taxonomies that are used in an informal way, such as the Climate Bonds Initiative taxonomy. So we had all these examples, and we tried to generate one that were used by all financial institutions in Mexico, whether they're investors or credit institutions. So we start by defining the objectives. What do we want to get? And there is a discussion when social inclusion is added to the formation of the taxonomy. And as you have all said, there needs to be a social part in environmental topics. So we started talking about social inclusion, and we identified some focus that would be able to compare social characteristics with mitigation and adaptation measures. So we decided to construct these working groups, which included a gender working group. So the different working groups were mainly formed by financial regulators, also by financial institutions, as well as guild associations. They were also formed by real companies in the economy that were actually going to be subject to the taxonomy. And they were also technical experts, which included gender experts. So they had different groups for energy, for agriculture, for construction, for manufacturing, for transport, and for waste management. And they had some transversal working groups, which included sustainable cities and transport and gender. So what we have now is that we have different sets of metrics and thresholds for all economical activities that have mitigation and adaptation focus, but we also have a transversal index on gender. So basically, a specific economical activity, now that the taxonomy was published in March 2023, can be evaluated both for social and for green purposes, for green issues. And I think it's the first one in the world, and actually we can have a broader comprehension on the possible implications of a certain activity, and for financial institutions as well, on how it's gonna, not only decarbonize their portfolios, but also the gender implications of all their investment and credits.
Okay, but let's probe this a little further. I'm not quite sure that everybody understands how this taxonomy then will reach the real economy. And we also have a question here from the audience, which asks, is the taxonomy actually inclusive? Is a sustainable and green taxonomy inclusive? So 2 questions in one. How does this reach the real economy, and is it inclusive or not?
Sure. So, the taxonomy right now is in a process of implementation. So what it means is that there's going to be pilot programs. The taxonomy is just a tool. that describes thresholds and metrics for measuring gender and mitigation and adaptation issues. But now it's going to be the implementation. So there are pilot programs in which financial institutions must classify their assets and their activities that they're investing them into these thresholds and these metrics. And there's also going to be regulations built around the taxonomy for them to be forced to use a taxonomy as part of the parameters that they're using for classifying their assets. So it will impact the real economy in the way that investors form their business strategies. And I mean, as long as we have a common understanding on what is green, on what is a gender approach, it will affect the long-term and the medium-term strategies of these investors and credit institutions. So yes, of course, it will impact the real economy. And I'm sorry, the other question was,
will it affect financial inclusion? And that would be, what's like, is a gender taxonomy, will that increase women's financial inclusion? And what would the transmission mechanism be there?
Yeah, we have several examples. Of course, there is metrics and there are some commitments that need to be met by financial institutions. And so the taxonomy is a super useful tool for them to really measure the impact of their investments and their credits. But it is also really useful for making up or creating new instruments with a gender perspective or with a green perspective. So for example, we have talked about labeled bonds in this panel or labeled credits. And with this common understanding among Mexican financial institutions, we can have truly comparable financial instruments. So gender labeled, a pink a credit will have the same definition in all banks across the Mexican banking system. So that's really useful for avoiding greenwashing or social washing and really having a measurable impact on the financial products that are being created right now.
Okay, thank you very much, Carlos. This is exciting stuff. Mexico is at the forefront and will be watching the country and how it unfolds. I mean, this is new, but we see it across the globe that taxonomies in the green and social realm are being enacted. So now we come to a question from the audience, which is about the potential trade-off between environmental and social intent. So have you seen examples where there are actually trade-offs? Have you seen examples where inadvertently vulnerable communities have been excluded by policies centered on stability and risk? So are there trade-offs, and if so, can you mention specific ones from your work? I would ask everybody, whoever wants to go first, please.
Can go first?
Yes.
First of all, just to say thank you, Carlos, for coming with the example from Mexico. And I think it's a great example. We keep, unfortunately, on having, I think, the conversation on, we start with one and then we go to the other. And it's not a real thing. So I think coming from the start with both environment and social is super important and a super good example. So congrats on that work. And I think it is in the same kind of way that we speak about trade-offs. I don't really like that word in this context because I don't believe they're trade-offs. I think in the first question, there was about environmental and social and how they are parts of the same, the two sides of the same coin. And it's all the actions we do have impacts, both on the environment, both on social, because people and the environment we cannot distinguish. I mean, we separated this because it's easier to study, because it's easier to do, but it's a separation that we created. It's not a real separation, right? Yeah. So when we look, what it gives us, when we look at both environmental and social, is that we are able to do better informed decisions. So we are able to actually do it better. We don't need to trade off, but we can actually make better decisions that leads to better results and better impacts. So I think when we speak, for instance, we hear often, should we do more renewables or should we care about lands of vulnerable people? We should and need to do more renewables, but we need to include the people. We need to engage the people that are being impacted by such projects and ensure that that is taken into account, that there's benefit sharing, and that they will not be left behind. Because also, as you mentioned, Klaus, if we're not doing that, then there's no transition that is going to happen because people will go against. So we speak about trade-offs, but I think it's actually about having more complemented and better projects in the ground, better decisions that are being made, and that we are able to have a greener sustainability that brings people along. I know it seems a bit, sometimes a bit too ambitious, but I think, I mean, concretely, an example that I like to use is not from a financial institution, but the Australian University has been looking for, I think, something like 17 years now. They've been looking at all the infrastructure projects in the country, and they've been looking at what are the reasons that lead to either cancellation or for delays in payments. Most of the reasons are for social reasons. There's in the last decade something like $30 billion that were either cancelled or delayed just due to social issues. So be it people complaining, be it lack of public consultation. So having embedded them from the start can have also then a difference on how these projects deliver the results that they're supposed to deliver and also be better for the business. So I think there is not necessarily a trade-off, but really about making decisions better.
Okay, thank you very much. Point taken. We'll not use the word trade-off anymore. Nuru, you want to go ahead?
Well,
what's your take?
I think I see things a bit different. So I totally, Joanna, I'm with you on that. But I think we also know that really, as economies are growing and incomes increase, there is more consumption, and this does create negative externalities. And really, these adverse environmental effects, they typically start to decelerate as the economies grow and policymakers start compensating society, right? So there is that, are we going to fuel industrial growth to create employment, or are we going to direct, introduce, for example, a carbon tax so we can compensate on some of these externalities? So there is some decisioning that kind of puts the environment and social, sometimes one is prioritized over another sometimes. And I think for low emitting economies, usually the priority is reducing income inequalities, right? And really, if we look at climate resilience, the issue is around adaptation. So there's also that trade-off between adaptation and mitigation, right? Depending on where the economy is. So I think there is some aspect of that T word. But really, I totally agree that there is that need for both the integration of social and environmental goals. And I think emerging markets in many ways, I think are more concerned about that link. And I think there are numerous ways in which this can be achieved. We've seen examples of central banks really trying to support innovation around SMEs. We've seen, for example, the increase in green, social, and sustainability bonds we talked about earlier, right? So, and sustainability linked bond market. And I think these type of instruments help bring vehicles through which that puts both the social and environment in the same focus area. Actually, it's interesting that emerging markets have issued more green, social, and sustainable bonds at the sovereign level than the developed markets, right? So developed markets are still very much still on the green, right? And green being that pure green in terms of climate adaptation and mitigation, whereas on the emerging market side, there is always that coupling with social, right? So you see more sustainability bonds, more SDG bonds. So I think these types of instruments help really just accelerate that transition to the green economy and make sure we're doing it in a socially responsible way.
Very interesting. Very interesting. Thank you, Nuru. Carlos, trade-offs. We use the word. Yes, no. What's your take?
Well, of course, I agree. There's trade-offs in everything that you do. I mean, if you decide to put on a green shirt, then there's a trade-off of wearing a blue shirt. You know, there's trade-offs in everything that you do. But I think the real approach here is understanding that environmental issues are really linked to social issues. So I differ a little bit from you, Nuru. I mean, you can have financial products that have both approaches. I mean, for example, we know that environmental issues, especially the most present ones, like the loss of biodiversity and climate change, will have a differentiated impact on the most vulnerable people in our communities. So we can actually have an approach of both adaptation, you know, and really solving the most concerning issues on the environmental part, while also fostering like a social inclusion development in our community. So yeah, I think that's the correct approach to really solve this about the trade-offs. I mean, of course, there's going to be trade-offs, but the approach is, you know, like attending these most vulnerable groups while also attending our most environmental pressing issues.
Okay, thank you very much, Carlos. Yes, please.
Yes, no, just to maybe come up, and why I said that I don't like the word is because I'm often asked when I have to choose between environment and social, which one do I choose? So that's where I think the word, when it comes, because it's a word that leads to opposition. So I agree with Carlos, and I think it's not that there's no trade-offs, but I think the word directly brings this opposition between environmental and social, and we shouldn't be speaking about this opposition, but rather how we can leverage one with the other. So that's where my thinking comes through.
Understood. So let's get some questions from the audience in. We still have 10 minutes. So the first one that I would like to pose to the group, and I'll bring in another one so you can already think which one you want to address. One audience member says, I wonder if you believe that there will ever be a truly sustainable business model centered on climate resilience, or are we chasing something impossible? So that would be one. And the other question here that I thought was interesting, knowledge gap exists at the supply side and at the policy level. What are the initiatives to plug this knowledge and skills gap? And maybe the third one, which just came in, how do we get European funding committed to mitigation to be redirected in part to adaptation in emerging markets? So there's three questions. Why don't you, Nuro, you want to address one of them?
Yeah, sure. I think I'll touch on the knowledge gap issue. I think indeed knowledge is important. I talked earlier about this issue of data being one of the hallmarks of effective, inclusive green finance. So I think some of the initiatives we've seen being effective through the SBFN is really this working group approach where we have actual regulators coming together to share good practice, and by doing so, establishing those hallmarks of what is good practice in sustainable finance, agenda setting, and policy formulation, and also that aspect of sequencing. And then the area of sequencing, I think what we've seen through SBFN members is the use of sustainable finance roadmaps as a very effective tool to help policymakers really just organize that ecosystem approach. So there's that policy coherence, there's knowledge flowing within the financial system, and then you're able to define what are those drivers and priorities for sustainable finance, making sure you're bringing in and looping in that inclusive finance. So I think the initiatives that I think I've seen being more effective is those partnerships and collaborations like UNEP-FI, AFI, SBFN, where you have policymakers sharing, NGFS, sharing information, sharing their data. SBFN, for example, has a measurement framework, and our 80+ members share data, and we then publish a global assessment report, and that kind of knowledge helps it really helps policymakers really understand what their policy alternatives are. So when they're looking at the various options in terms of which policies to effect when, it usually helps seeing who has done what previously, right? Because in this space, when everyone is bounded by time and resources, you really want to see what's worked in which country and what's been effective before you embark on your process. Yeah, so maybe I can answer it that way.
That's where networks unfold their magical power, like the SBFN. Okay, Carlos, you also want to take one of these questions. Please go ahead.
Yes, I want to take on the one that if we really believe that there can be truly sustainable business models centered on climate resilience. Yeah, first of all, I think we need to understand that we are right now in a climate emergency, and that we are on a social emergency, which is just like an increasing social gap around the world. And I mean, the 50% less poor owns less than 2% of the wealth of the world's wealth. So yeah, we are in an emergency right now. And just to complement what was Noor saying about, and she mentioned the NGFS and its programs. Well, and social risks are also financial risks. So they will affect on the credit and the market risks that are normally analyzed in our institutions. And since climate change and the social emergency will impact on the real economy, they will be affecting financial institutions. So yes, I think that understanding the risks and opportunities in this and really integrating them in the medium and long term of business models, it's a must now if a company wants to exist in 50 or 80 years. So yeah, if I believe that business models must be resilient and sustainable driven, yeah, it's a must if they want to ensure their profitability in the long term.
Thank you, Carlos. Okay, so now there's two questions that come in that I think are very interesting. One is if the last COP was a lot of talk about loss and damage, if that is an opportunity for more work on inclusive green finance. And the question on European funding from mitigation to adaptation is not yet addressed. We don't have time to really go there, but my impression is that these conversations are picking up a lot in speed. And I think there is a lot of opportunity now to plug inclusive green finance into many of the conversations, maybe the G7 Global Shield, all the initiatives on just transition, where I know that UNEP-FI is working on, GIZ is working on it. So the opportunity to work on these topics is bigger than ever. 3 minutes left. Everybody in the panel, what's next? What's the most important thing that you're working on? Just less than a minute each. Noor, do you want to start?
Yeah, so maybe what I could say is what's next is really just looking at that. I think we've moved from really raising awareness and appreciation at the policy level to moving towards implementation and really just practicing good, implementing good practice in terms of really defining your policy alternatives and the instruments towards that, and not forgetting incentives. So I think we see that policymakers are increasingly paying attention to, again, what we've talked about today, that nexus between green and financial inclusion. But I think one of my parting shots really is just reminding us that it's about outcomes. It's not about the instrument, right? So I know we've talked about different instruments and examples, but ultimately it's about those social outcomes that we should be looking at and behavior change. Thanks.
Thank you. Joanna, you want to go next? What's next for you?
So from our side, so on the just transition, and maybe then entering a bit on these questions, but not taking them here, we are launching now at COP28 a guidance together with the International Labour Organization on just transition for banks and insurance. So that is coming out on COP28, and there will be a large event and it will be available at our website. And we hope that's the start of a lot of conversations around just transition and the work being done there. And this, of course, then we are continuing our work on financial health and inclusion, which we do put in the guidance of just transition as an enabler on just transition. I see there's 1 minute. I'll leave Carlos also speak.
Okay, Carlos, you have the last words. Go ahead. What's next for
Yeah.
you in Mexico?
We're working on capital mobilization towards sustainability through 4 specific actions. First is information through ESG, internationally recognized standards and tools such as a taxonomy, ESG risk inclusion into financial institutions, construction of capacities, which is central at any level. And fourth one is regulation. We really need to get a more solid regulation around ESG topics.
Okay, thank you very much. So all that's left for me is thank my panel. Thank you very much for tuning in and have a great rest of the day. Bye-bye.